So much happening in Washington today, including that blockbuster new budget from the Trump administration, just released overnight, shows a major increase to defense spending paid for with billions of dollars in cuts from the State Department, domestic programs. For now, Medicare and Social Security untouched, does not reduce the deficit, would be a dramatic change in the way Washington does business. We're joined now by the man behind the plan, the White House Budget Director, Mick Mulvaney. Thank you so much for coming in today. I know you've had a busy morning already. So you've got the State Department and the Environmental Protection Agency being cut by almost a third each, 20% cut in the National Institutes of Health. Key members of your own party on Capitol Hill already saying cuts this deep mean the budget's dead on arrival.
Sure, and keep in mind, George, that, and I used to be in Congress, and I represented a district. If you're a senator, you represent the whole state. There's also a lot of special interest involved in the political process. The president's not beholden to any of those. The president wrote a budget for the nation, and we wrote a budget based upon his campaign promises, and that's what you see in the budget. We took his words and turned them into numbers.
But, you know, you also are trying to turn into numbers that new funding to build the wall on the Mexican border. Another issue where Republicans are getting cold feet right now. Democrats are saying that's going to lead to a government shutdown if you try to pass that increase in April.
Yeah, but they always say that. Again, we're talking now about the 2018 budget. There will be some work on the 2017 spending as well in the weird world that Washington works. We're in the middle of the 2017 fiscal year budget right now. There's enough money to run the government through the end of April. The president's only asking for $1.5 billion, I think, for the rest of this year to start the wall. Not that much money in a $1 trillion discretionary budget. So it doesn't surprise me that the Democrats are threatening that. But in the greater scheme of things, the president promised a wall. He's going to deliver it.
But he promised Mexico would pay for it, not the U.S. taxpayers would pay for it.
I'm responsible for getting the money together to build the wall, and that's what I'm doing.
You talk about the president keeping his promises. The president also promised to balance the budget, to bring down the national debt. This doesn't reduce the deficit by a dime.
Sure, and that's absolutely correct. This is a budget blueprint. It's really the spending part of the budget. The federal budget actually has a bunch of different pieces. As you know, we have tax revenues in there. You have longer-term policies. You have mandatory spending. All of that will be encapsulated in a budget that will release in May. This is the first piece of the budget to allow the spending process to start in Congress.
But you talk about the president's promises. He said he's not going to touch that mandatory spending. He's not going to touch Social Security. He's not going to touch Medicare. You can't get to balance if you don't touch those programs.
And the president keeps his promise. There's no question about that. Again, this budget, just discretionary spending. What it doesn't do, George, is add to the budget. So you're looking at adding $54 billion to defense. You're adding to border enforcement. You're adding to law enforcement generally. You're increasing spending for health care for veterans. You're increasing spending for school choice. And you're doing all of that without adding to the budget. Adding to the deficit.
Let's talk about health care for a minute. You mentioned you're a member of Congress. Your former colleagues in the House Freedom Caucus are saying they simply cannot support Obamacare repeal as currently drafted by the president. It's currently drafted by Speaker Ryan. So what kind of changes is it going to take to get this through the House?
I think you'll learn more today. I think the budget will go, I'm talking about budget again. Healthcare will go through the budget committee, I believe, before the end of the day today, and probably be brought to the floor after it goes to the rules committee next week. So there's a chance to talk about changing the bill today, talk about changing the bill over the weekend, and then again in rules. Go back to the very beginning of this conversation. This bill was not pre-cooked. We did not do what the Democrats did with health care, which is pre-negotiated and force it down lawmakers' throats. We introduced a framework. As much repeal as we could get given the current law, as much replace as we can get given the current law. If members of Congress want to change that to make it better, that's fine. That's their right.
But any changes in the House are going to make it even harder to get through the Senate.
But again, you'll deal with that sequentially, right? We'll have a bill that passes the House probably by the end of next week, and then we do to make it even better perhaps in the Senate. But again, this is part of the legislative process. If people seem to think that there's a magical bill that sails through Congress, that's not the way any good legislation works.
Mr. Mulvaney, thanks for coming in this morning.
Thanks, George.